Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast and History Valley. My name is Derek Lambert, in case you're new to the channel, and I'm going to be having a discussion interview with Jacob Berman. It'll be a dialogue. We'll go back and forth. But one of the reasons this inspired me to make this episode for you is both Jacob and myself have spent several years dialoguing, entertaining, listening, reading the long debate from academics we've heard. And our hope is we don't want to tell you what to think, who to side with. We might along the way give a little bit of our own little cherry-picked bias support for certain academia, certain scholars who have certain views along the way. But we're hoping to, if you're hungry, to use an analogy of food, join us for the buffet. Okay, we want to lay out the whole spectrum of different ideas, different foods. You want desserts? Okay, this is the buffet over here. Oh, you want salads? Oh, okay. Are you interested in meats or you want pastas? We want to lay out a variety of different scholars and dabble with everything from New Testament to Old Testament, have a fun dialogue. So, because I wanted to host this and kind of entertain my friend Jacob Berman, who interviews doctors left and right. He's done more scholarly interviews than MythVision with a broader variety of academics than I myself have done. So kudos to Jacob, who has been through quite a bit. There's been ups and downs. We both have experienced with our channels, and he's still rocking and rolling. So I ask everybody who is watching right now, please take the time to go subscribe to History Valley and check him out. He's live over there right now. Why Biblical Scholars Can't Agree. And we're going to get into the mushy gushy, hopefully. Have a good time doing so. Make sure you subscribe to him. If there's any mods in the chat throughout the stream, please do us a favor, just like I just did now. And go subscribe. Oh, someone said take the glasses off. I forgot to have. Okay. Yeah, I've been reading all day here, trying to get some stuff done. That being said, Jacob, welcome, man. Let's have some fun, brother. How are you?
I'm great, Derek. Thank you for having me on. And thank you for the introduction earlier. And are you doing well yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm looking orange here. Let's see if I can adjust this thing to make me less orange. I don't want to embarrass people here with my tan. That probably made it better, I suspect. Okay.
Yeah, maybe a little bit more balanced, sort of, but it doesn't have to be perfect. I mean,
of course. I just been working all morning. So, Jacob, let's start somewhere, basic questions, and then we'll get into some scholarship and ideas, because we have a stream that we're also going to be doing on Paul, specifically really hammering some of the ideas you picked up along the way. The question I have is, why did you start your channel? Everyone asks me all the time, and I explain. What is your reason for starting History Valley?
Well, I started my channel because, as I've said before, that back in 2013, I decided to investigate the origins of the Abrahamic religions, because at first I was investigating hell, because I never converted. Okay, I don't have a deconversion story. I've always been an atheist, but for a time, hell scared me, and so I wanted to investigate it. And when I realized that, God has a father, or Yahweh has a father, when I got to the book of Deuteronomy, I wanted to look into scholarship and try to figure out, does anyone know, or who is Yahweh's father? Because that's where it started. When I first came on your show back in, I think it was 2019, that was the first discussion we had. God as a father.
It's been a minute.
It has. And that's really where it went. I went down that rabbit hole about Yahweh and El and the Canaanite gods, and also the Sumerian gods, and eventually, as I learned more, I decided to start a YouTube channel so that way I can educate other people with the information that I learned, bring on the scholars on my channel so other people can learn as I learn. They can learn with me. That's the idea.
That makes perfect sense. I felt similar, to my experience. It was just certain ideas that we didn't find a lot of on YouTube. There wasn't a lot of talk about it. And so I thought, what better way than to bring real wise, critical thinkers who've dug deep into certain things is to the public. So there might be me dialoguing and adding my 2 cents along the way with this journey for those who are viewing, because we both have a similar experience with academia in the sense that we're learning from different scholars, and you have one on who says this and one on that says the exact opposite of this.
Precisely.
All the time. And so we always hear what's the consensus, right? And don't get me wrong, it's cool to find out what a field generally thinks about something. But then there are other PhDs that are really, really smart that we're listening to, and they've got really interesting, good points they bring up. And it just makes it a quagmire often on trying to figure out what is going on in the Bible, whether it's Old Testament, New Testament, church fathers. I mean, there's just never a solid end to this debate, discussion, academic. If we had a time machine, sure. If we had like concrete empirical evidence to support some of the ideas, why do you think there is always going to be disagreement on these issues in your views?
Yeah, I think that when you look at Paul's letters, for instance, the letters, a lot of people will say, okay, there's a stronger consensus there. The letters are written in the 80-50s. And yes, as you said, we're going to be doing a stream in early July where we're going to discuss that more in depth. So, for instance, I'll have one scholar on. Let's say it was
I
Bruce
love name
Chilton.
drops, by the way.
Yeah.
Name drop all you can.
And Bruce Chilton debated Nina Livesey on my channel on did the 7 letters of Paul, are they authentic? Are they pre-war texts? And Bruce and Nina totally disagree, because Bruce will see that, okay, there's not really a problem here. These 7 letters can clearly be seen as pre-war documents. Whereas Nina will argue these are literary epistolary fiction that were created in the 2nd century after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Placing an emphasis on the Marcionite text, the Marcionite edition being earlier, and the canonical edition being a later elaboration. So I guess you could call it a forgery of a fabrication. Because when something is fabricated, that's another level. A fabrication means it's completely... well, before I continue explaining that, I know that some will say, don't use those words to talk about ancient documents. But if that happened today, it would be called that, though.
Right.
That's why I'm saying this. So if Paul wrote nothing, if that's the case, if Paul wrote nothing, then yes, the letters wouldn't just be forgeries; they would be fabricated. When you say something's a forgery, that implies it's a real. It's like a fake dollar bill.
Right.
So then there's a real dollar bill. But if it's fabricated, there's nothing real from it. It's just totally fake. So if the letters were fabricated, then none of it goes, then nothing, not a syllable, none of it goes back to Paul. Now,
so it wouldn't be forged; it would just be fabricated. Technically.
Yeah, completely fabricated.
And it could be a noble lie of fabrication. Like she talks about, there's schools of philosophy, and she's taken that angle. But the consensus is, Jacob, that 7 are real, right? We need to accept 7 or else it feels like there's this pressure. You're frowned upon if you don't.
I experienced this years ago. I believe that Paul's letters were written in the 80s, 90s. I believe it again. For 2 years, I suppressed it because I succumbed to fear. I don't like that I did, but I did. Is the honest truth. I succumbed to fear. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to let that happen again. No. Because the mental gymnastics, I'm going to call it like it is, mental gymnastics that one has to engage trying to make every inch of the 7 letters of Paul, so-called authentic letters of Paul, date before the war is astronomical. 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16 talks about the wrath of God coming upon the Judeans.
Mm-hmm.
There are even scholars like Paula Fredrickson who will say that's an interpolation.
Right.
It was added into 1 Thessalonians. Well, if we can admit, right, that there were post-70 additions into those letters, then dare I say, how do we know that F.C. Bauer wasn't right? That the whole letter of 1 Thessalonians is after 70 AD.
Okay, this is going to take me. So this is a really I love that you painted it this way, because this book I just started reading, Back to Reason, Minimalism and Biblical Studies, Niels Peter Lemke. He's a minimalist. By the way, I'm reading this and I'm going, did I even understand what minimalism is? That's a curse word. That's a 4-letter word in the Bible scholars, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament academics, Dead Sea Scroll scholars. Like most of these people that I've been engaging with for the longest time, look at biblical minimalism and they frown upon it. And they kind of go, you guys are part of the extreme. You've got the minimalist and you've got the maximalist. And Niels, the way that I'm reading so far, and I'm at the beginning of the book, he portrayed there's 2 kind of schools of thought. Academics who suppose the Bible has historical reality and truth until external evidence debunks the biblical narrative. So they assume glass half full, we might as well just accept the narrative that what it says in the Bible happened until we can debunk based on external voices or external data to say, well, hold on, we have good reason to doubt that narrative. Meaning, let's go to Josiah's reforms. I don't want to dwell on this too deep because I expect to do some episodes where we dive into Josiah's reforms. It is it is a given that this happened. These reforms happened. Everything that's documented there actually occurred. By the way, everything I'm saying here applies to Paul and everything you're saying about New Testament scholarship as well. It's the same pendulum swing that I see. We grant it happened until contrary evidence, like the judgment of the Jews has come upon us. Oh my gosh, this must have been added after 70. Well, why not just say all of that text was added or written after 70 instead of just inserting this? Why assume, right? This is the thing. And then I just want to paint the minimalist, and I want to have you jump in and give your say just so people understand.
Yeah.
The minimalist, it's often portrayed, start with doubt. Doubt. Don't assume. Doubt until you have external confirmation. You need to remain agnostic or doubtful about the events you're reading. Do not just accept the Bible's narrative, whether it's Paul's letters, whether it's Josiah's reforms, whether it's Moses and the Exodus, Abraham, which we have good reasons, and Thomas L. Thompson and others have brought forward why we should be very cautious. We're dealing with mythical characters in story form, right? And it's much more complex than that. So the 2 schools of thought are grant it until otherwise proven by false, external evidence that shows that couldn't have happened or didn't happen. Or start with doubt until you can confirm it with external evidence that there's some root here or historical credibility to the event. And that seems to be the teeter-totter here, man. That seems to be the pendulum of, and most of the scholars want to portray themselves as in the middle. Niels Peter Lemke says they love to go, oh, we're not maximalist and we're not minimalist. But argues in this book that those claim that they're not maximalist are using the same, they're on the same side as the maximalist in a sense, granting biblical realities, yet they just want to be a little more critical instead of assuming the more minimalist approach. And so I hear it with Paul right now as you're describing this whole issue. Was that interpolated, or was all of this written later and backdated to assume it's happening, earlier in some of these letters? I don't know.
What makes it worse is there's a Greek word in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16 that makes it even much more difficult to claim the wrath of God as anything but the temple being destroyed. telos. It indicates finality, a conclusion, the final. So in other words, it's the final wrath of God. How could Paul say such a bold thing before 70 AD? Are you kidding me? When you read the church fathers, the wrath of God is always, to my knowledge, so I'll put it that way, to my knowledge, the wrath of God is always the destruction of the temple. Had that been in the Gospels, scholars would be like, oh, okay, of course, we assumed the Gospels after 70 AD. Okay. If that had been in the Gospels, they wouldn't be arguing like this. But it's in Paul. It's in almighty, precious Paul. Has to be before 70. Oh, it's about Claudius' expulsion. Explain to me how that makes the slightest sense.
Or Caligula setting up the temple or the statue. Yeah.
How is that mass destruction? That's not a wrath. It's a statue. It's a statue, for goodness sakes. That's not death and destruction on a mass scale. That's what the wrath is supposed to be. So, and then, what about 1 Corinthians? What about this? How about Paul and his co-author Sophanes saying, oh, the temple is inside you. We should not worship God in temples subject to the flames. Really? That's in 1 Corinthians. Yeah.
What verse is that?
It's in, let me find it for you. Hold on.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. 1 Corinthians 3:13-18.
All right. I'm just whipping up, let me do this.
Yeah.
crossbible.com. 1 Corinthians
3:13-18.
All right. Bear with me here.
No problem.
I'm just going NIV. It should convey it, I imagine, but we'll see. Okay. 13 through 18.
Yeah.
Their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. It has been built. Is that the specific verse, or you want me to keep going?
13-18.
Okay, if it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss. Dude, there's a lot of burned up here, right? Don't you know yourself, you are God's temple. Well, that's kind of an ironic thing to state before the temple has fallen. Now, could it be possible? Yeah, that's what scholars try to do. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. I mean, bro, if you wanted to replace a non-existent sanctuary, that you are the sanctuary, this would make sense in light of the fall of Jerusalem.
That's exactly my point.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you see how problematic it is to make that, to force that before 70? And again, we hear that from many scholars that 1 Corinthians was interpolated with that stuff that's talked about in the pastoral letters about women being quiet in the church. That's in 1 Corinthians. So they're already admitting that 1 Corinthians was tampered with. Or maybe it's because the whole damn thing is later. So that's the other issue. Now, when you look at 1 Clement, because 1 Clement was written in the 90s AD. All right, let's take a look at 1 Clement, because we got a problem here. These letters are written after 70 AD. So what does 1 Clement say about the pre-war original Paul?
1 Clement what?
All right, just word search Kephas in there. No. I'll make it easier for you. Hold on.
Do you have a specific letter? Is it letter to the Corinthians?
Let me find it for you. First Clement 47:1 to 47:3.
I imagine it's letter to the Corinthians, right? And you said look up who?
Yeah. It's verse 47:1 to 47:3. 47:1 to 3. So we'll be looking at here.
Hold up. There's a lot here on this page.
Yeah.
Right. Chapter 47, 1 to 3. Bear with me. I want to share this so people can see. I got it expanded too. All right, here we go. 47, 1 to 3. Your recent discord is worse than the former, which took place in the times of Paul. Take up the epistle of the blessed apostle Paul. What did he write to you at the time when the gospel first began to be preached? Truly, under the inspiration of the Spirit, he wrote to you concerning himself and Cephas and Apollos, because even then parties had been formed among you, but that inclination for one above another entailed less guilt upon you. Inasmuch as your partialities were then shown towards apostles already of high reputation and towards a man whom they had approved. But now reflect who those are that have perverted you and lessened the renown of your far-famed brotherly love. It is disgraceful, beloved, yea, highly disgraceful and unworthy of your Christian profession, that such a thing should be heard of as that the most steadfast and ancient church of the Corinthians should, on account of one or two persons, engage in sedition against its presbyters. And this rumor has reached not only us, but those also who are unconnected with us, so that through your infatuation, the name of the Lord is blasphemed, while danger is also brought upon yourself.
So, the way I take this is, I think there was a Paul in the AD 30s, a genuine earlier Paul that could have written something like First Corinthians. I just don't think it's, well, the whole thing. I suspect it's much smaller.
You're taking the kind of position.
Yeah.
M. David Litwell wrote an interesting book about like new revelations, and he's talking about like a new model, and I can't remember the model he calls his gospel model, but he thinks that a scribe of some sort started writing material around the post-war time, a very primitive form of a gospel material, and that it's kind of a rolling text, so that the final stage of gospel material really ends up happening in post 70. He argues post Bar Kokhba, because he says there are elements in the gospels that only make sense after post Bar Kokhba period, and he's saying, how do you explain this post 70 material and this post Bar Kokhba material in light of this? And his model is like a wave something model, where he thinks that there's a rolling. Are you suggesting that Paul has some primitive material by a scribe, maybe even Paul himself, or someone in the name of whatever, and it's rolling into the post-war period? Is that your suggestion?
Sort of, but I just don't think much of it even went back to a pre-war Paul. So let me clarify something here. Am I saying that Paul's letters are forgeries? So Jerome mentions an individual. This was noted by scholars way back then, like Charles Travers Wood, that there's an individual called Saul, whose family came from Giscala. They fled to Tarsus. So Saul was a young man, okay? And what's going on is that this Saul was fleeing when all of Judea was laid waste. That's what Jerome says. And the Jews were expelled across the world.
Do you have that source, by the way? We can pop up.
Yeah.
It'd be really cool to show people.
Sure.
Sorry to sidetrack you. Everybody hit that like button, whether you're watching this on History Valley or MythVision. Make some noise so the algorithm will spread this video.
I just need to find it real quick. I included it in a slide that I did with James Valiant and Douglas Del Tondo a couple of days ago.
Do you want to share that slide just to show people?
It might be easier that I did.
Okay.
Just that.
Go ahead. Someone said, better call Saul. Yeah. This is really, I mean, this is in the vein of our discussion we've had when you came.
How many Sauls? Yeah. How many Sauls are we calling? It's 3 of them. But anyway, I got it up here. You see it down there?
Yep. There we go. Okay.
So Jerome says, Paul, formerly called Saul, an apostle outside the number of the 12 apostles, was of the tribe of Benjamin and the town of Giscala in Judea. When this was taken by the Romans, he removed with his parents to Tarsus in Cilicia. Sent by them to Jerusalem to study law, he was educated by Gamaliel, a most learned man, whom Luke mentions. Now, we look at the second bullet point. Jerome goes further. He says, they say that the apostle Paul's parents were from the region of Giscala in Judea. and that when the whole province was laid waste by the hands of the Romans and the Jews were dispersed into the world, they removed to the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. As a young man, he followed the condition of his parents. And Jerome continues. He talks about how this Saul said he's a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He's a Benjamite. You see that he's making the same kind of claims that we see in Philippians. And this is this post-war Saul of Tarsus. Now, Jerome notes elsewhere that he does say Paul died under Nero. So he is contradicting himself by citing this other source that he had that tells him, oh, that we got a Saul here who's active after the war and outlived Emperor Nero. So when I look at 1 Clement, I look at the Acts of Paul. The Acts of Paul is where we get the death of Paul from under Nero. And then you got Jerome in the 4th century saying this. That's 3 different chronologies for Paul. Then it gets interesting because when you look at the letters in light of all this, you look at 2 Corinthians. How many shipwrecks does Paul have? 3. Dare I say it's symbolic to represent how many Pauls there are involved in the situation? So when you look at Clement, he says things like Paul was in chains 7 times. We get details here that we don't get in the canonical letters.
Right.
So he's actually contradicting the letters. And then at one point, Clement says Paul was, at the end of his life, was furthest west of the empire. Now, some will say, oh, there it is. Clement knows Romans because in Romans 15, Paul goes to Spain, right? But Clement doesn't say he got that from a letter. Where did he get it from? He doesn't say. You see, that's the interesting thing. When it comes to material that we see in 1 Corinthians that he's quoting, he says he got that from a letter. We just saw that earlier. But if we look at the other stuff, he doesn't say he got that from letters. So it's curious.
Let me try to bring it back to the pendulum swinging of minimal maximalism. And what's interesting about this to me is there's assumption that if you just Thomas Jefferson Paul, for the viewer, if you just Thomas Jefferson the Gospels, just Thomas Jefferson the Old Testament, just Thomas Jefferson Paul's letters. And what I mean by that is, for those who don't know, Thomas Jefferson, famous U.S. president, had his own Bible. He was a rationalist in the post-Enlightenment world, and he assumed that if you just strip away and cut all the magic, all the miracles, you'll get the history. But this assumption thinks that there's an actual historical grounding and a reality to the material, which is an assumption. That it's circular reasoning, starting with that kind of presupposition that you're actually talking about history to begin with. So if you just remove the magic, you'll get to the bone. You'll remove the meat, but you'll get to the bone. And what you're kind of painting makes me question, especially when Clement's coming up with these 7 times he was in chains, this and that. If there's already legends in Clement's day, and he's supposedly writing in the 90s, this material, let's just grant it that he is, even though Nina she's arguing that it could be later in her book. I understand why she says it. I understand why she says that. I don't agree. I think, in a way, Clement actually reinforces in a different way that the letters are post-70. Look how ignorant he is of the canonical text, where he talks about when he talks about material that parallels other texts, he won't say he got it from those texts. Right. He had some other source. It wasn't. He didn't get it from the letter to the Romans. I don't know where he got it from. I suppose it's. Maybe Paul wrote something like Romans. I don't know. But look, go ahead. Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is why are we assuming? Why are we starting with that assumption instead of granting that, how do we know this isn't legends all the way down, turtles all the way down? Why are we, or some kind of mythic origin? Why do we need to be, we're on a pursuit for what happened. We're always on this pursuit. What actually happened? We need the real thing. And what if that has never been the goal of these letters, of the Gospels, of the biblical text? The same way Homer or Virgil's Aeneid at best echoes sentiments of things that are going on with Rome and its geopolitical and mythic tradition, but it's not telling you anything historical in that sense. At most, it's pointing toward the one chosen king who would have been Caesar Augustus. And so I'm just throwing that out there as two guys
I
who
understand.
mythicist, historicist. We've been like just kind of juggling, and I still sympathize with various different views. And I don't know if that's because I'm not indoctrinated, and I don't mean this to be derogatory, but if I went on a PhD program through a particular school, I'm going to be like honing in on a particular methodology and a particular thing. And I could imagine it would be taboo in that field, in that academic circle, to push against the grain of the models that they're presenting and the way your methods need to go. This is the reason we know this is we're interviewing a scholar from a different school who has classics in their background also. So they have a broader awareness of the world that is in the Greek and Roman world. And then you get someone who only focuses on Jewish antecedents or Jewish world. And then like they come in and they do not, they're fundamentally opposed to each other on how they approach the data. Well, what do you do with that?
Yeah. When I look at Clement, this is the way I look at it. Let's say a world later. Here's the problem I'm having with it. He specifies that he gets his information that parallels 1 Corinthians from a letter of Paul's. When it comes to the other stuff, that parallels stuff like we see in Romans and some of the other letters that are in the New Testament, he doesn't say he got that from letters. That I find strange. If I assume that he knows the canonical letters, all of them, in the 2nd century, whoever wrote 1 Clement, because I assume it was written by Clement in the 80s. So if I move it to the 2nd century, I move it decades later into time. My issue is, why would this author, whoever this person was, state, okay, I admit that I got that little bit about Paul being frustrated with Cephas and Apollos from a letter, but all that other business, I'm not going to admit came from letters. That's kind of odd. Now, I can understand if he's writing in the 90s and he's looking with a more limited Pauline text, and the canonical Pauline text did not exist yet. But if he's doing this in the 2nd century, I find it a little perplexing that he would selectively say, I got those bits from a letter, but not those other bits.
Yeah,
that's the way I look at it.
Yeah. This is stuff. I think we should focus on the very specifics of Paul in our Paul episode. I don't want to get lost in Paul because I know you have a lot to say on this. And I'm trying the best to do a satellite. We might get in, but I want to remain as much as I can in a satellite view and not a microscope view on Paul.
Sure.
Because you get sucked into the black hole of Paul and want to talk about him and mainly focus on that.
I will.
But what about the synoptic problem? What about, I don't want to hone in on that and get stuck on that either. But like, Pauline letters, Old Testament, the various scholars we've presented, I'm trying to say, what do we do here, Jacob? I'm trying to also tell other academics who get butthurt or upset when you and I get excited about a hypothesis because we're listening to all of them. I can't help that some of them sound and present data that seems more convincing to us than them.
Yeah.
And what do? Well, wait till 100 other scholars agree on a position. Then when those 100 other scholars agree, you're allowed to jump on it because who are you, Jacob? You're not an expert. I'm not an expert.
That's called collectivism. It's fallacious. It is self-contradictory. It is inconsistent, and it is destined to fail. Collectivist groups always without fail, turn into a disaster. When you allow pressure to dictate what you're saying, it's like selling your soul. You throw away who you truly are, and it's not going to end well. It never will. It's not worth it. Stay who you truly are at all times. Do not give in the pressure ever to anyone. That's all I will say about that.
Yeah.
But to finish what I'm saying about Saul of Giscala, I put Saul of Giscala in the 80-90s because that's the era that Jerome's putting him in after 70 AD, after the First Jewish-Roman War. And what you see that I think this individual changes his name to Paul, because that's pretty much what we're told. So that's where Acts is getting the idea from, because this guy is changing his name because he is overtaking the authority of a real pre-war Paul. That's what's going on here.
I didn't want to get lost in the
Yeah.
Paul, but we're back at
I
Paul
know.
again.
I'm just finishing to conclude what I was saying,
yeah.
so we can move on.
When you bring the Paul stuff in the next episode, let's bring those sources, because you're making a claim here that is worthy of showing the sources of why you suggest a Saul of Giscala is hijacking, or you can paint that narrative in more depth. But it sounds like another hypothesis that could be brought in, hypothesis to rough up the whole views of Paul that people have in the academic world, and maybe just another one to add to the buffet of saying, well, what about this one? Could this not make sense as well? Okay. So let's shift gears a little here, because I know we have a whole episode on Paul. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
The synoptic problem. You used to call me... Total transparency, this is worth it, because dude, you were on this synoptic thing like hardcore. Jacob would call me, hey man, let's talk about this for a second, and we'd be on the phone. It was 5 minutes in, we're back to like, okay, so here's what I think, and like you'd like try to make sense of this, and then a new thing would come. You go, okay, I'm not so sure about this anymore. This scholar made an interesting point over here, and I'm going like, I never got really into the whole let me solve the synoptic problem. For those who don't know what that is, you've got three gospels that look similar. They're seen together. They have very shared content. And that's also how you can really clearly identify their contradictions and their similarities. And then you get John. And you're trying to figure out who wrote first and what order and how do we explain this and how does this factor into Paul's letters? Because it's usually a system. All of this academia is built on a foundation. And as Dr. Price used to say years ago, if you take Paul away from them, the whole house of cards falls and it's just a confusing mess. And how do you figure out the chronology of the New Testament? How do you understand what's really going on?
And let me say that some don't. Some just give up. What am I talking about? The give up hypothesis? The multi-source theory. To me, the multi-source theory is when you crash out. You totally give up on trying to figure out how the gospels are related, because instead, what you do is you make up a bunch of hypothetical documents to say otherwise. Now, I'm not trying to diss on great scholars that have believed in that position, like the late M.E. Boimar, Philippe Roland, and also the present Delbert Burket. Delbert Burket, very interesting theory. It's the Grisbeck. It's kind of like the Grisbeck hypothesis on steroids.
What's the Grisbeck hypothesis for
the idea that Mark is conflating Matthew and Luke, but instead
that Mark came after Matthew and Luke.
Yes, that's the Grisbeck theory. Okay. But instead of saying that, Burket suggests that Mark is conflating Proto-Mark A and Proto-Mark B. So he says that Proto-Mark A is known to Matthew, Proto-Mark B is known to Luke, and that those two proto-marks are copying an older proto-mark. Now, so you have three proto-marks right there. We have three hypothetical documents out the gate. He retains Q, and he has Matthew and Luke using Q. So the reason he says is that, well, Matthew has independent material, Luke has independent material, Mark has independent material. They're not in each other. So he tries to explain these complications away by saying, okay, they're using these other documents. And the reason Mark looks like it's a conflation, because it is. He's conflating those two sources. It also explains the minor agreements. I'm skipping a lot here because it's super complicated. Super complicated.
Yeah.
I wondered about it. Like, it's like a bold hypothesis. I thought about it. I even wanted to scour church father sources to see if there's even the slightest hint that something like this was true. I concluded it's just extremely unlikely, especially for the church fathers to have missed so many documents. When you look at Papias, I would say there's some sprinkles of truth, because Papias does know a lot of sayings texts that he attributes to various different people, including even one to Thomas, which I dare say was an older form of our Gospel of Thomas. Cyril of Jerusalem in the 4th century does say that the Gospel of Thomas was written in the 3rd century by Thomas the Manichaean. Now, what does that tell me? This is interesting because the Gospel of Thomas appears to have interpolations. Now, you know this, Derek, but I do not like arguing something's an interpolation. I hate it. I don't care what it involves, unless the evidence was super powerful. and I'll only concede something's an interpolation based on two criteria. The first criteria is if an ancient document tells us that another document was altered, so it's an admission that it was altered, but we don't otherwise have manuscript evidence to see what was altered. So we can try to guess, but at least it gives us a justification to guess. The second criteria is if we have a manuscript of a document different from a manuscript of the same document that we have in which said material is missing. That way, I'm not playing a guessing game. Right?
You're not assuming based on the language or
I'll give you
sentence structure, sounds, or the context, because that could be easily. You're saying, I found a document, or there's an alternative account of this that doesn't have this material, and here you have this material.
Exactly.
Okay.
The reason why some people say, "Oh, come on, Jacob, we can tell." No, you can't, because you have one scholar disagreeing with another on what was an interpolation. It's too subjective. That's the problem.
This is okay. From that, just giving a highlight of the Old Testament. That's similar problems I find when I'm reading the Old Testament text about Moses' existence. I'm reading a bunch of different academics, and many of them will find the mention of Moses in Isaiah or the mention in Hosea or different passages where Moses' name comes up in books they already suppose for other reasons that they date this material to the 8th, 9th century BCE. The character of the prophet exists back here. And I go, these scholars who see the name Moses actually go, that sounds post-exilic. The whole material in that section, or adding in Moses in these narratives, a lot of them recognize, and they're doing textual criticism, and they go, Moses is inserted in this text. This isn't original. And then some of them say the whole chapters seem to be added later in the name of prophet Isaiah or Hosea or whoever.
Way too convoluted.
You can't even get any of them to really agree on all of these.
I don't mean to interrupt what you were saying, but I've always had a problem with the documentary hypothesis. It's like, there are some people that could look at me with a straight face and say, I just missed Q, but the documentary hypothesis is definitely true. I'm like, excuse me? So you wanna give me some proof that any of these floating magical documents, D, E, P, J, R, whatever letters you want to throw from the alphabet on there existed? Are you kidding me? You haven't a clue. So so you want me to believe dogmatically in these fairy tale documents we have absolutely no evidence for? Come on. So it's now it's just, they might say to me, okay, well the text looks like it was written in stages, or it looks like it was written by multiple people. Well, even Joel Baden said that it could have been written by a group of people at around the same time. He said something to that effect to me in when I interviewed him last year. I'm like, okay, that actually makes more sense to me. Why couldn't just a group of people just be writing the Torah at the same moment? And we don't have to speculate about centuries of development that we don't have a clue on.
Each of those layers, like you're describing, by the way, for those who aren't into the documentary hypothesis, they'll use like the LOS. It sounds more primitive, or it has these attributes they would say are primitive. And this is what's wild to me. Jonathan Adler comes in and pulls up all this archeology and shows that the common people, are still polytheistic into the third.
Absolutely. I love his work. It's amazing.
Yeah. So you still have polytheistic Yahwism championing the day in the 2nd to 3rd centuries BCE prior to Hasmoneans and their dynasty. And so how can you know these polytheistic undertones that we find within the Bible, the fossils that we see, Deuteronomy 32, and hints at God having a father?
Absolutely.
How do you know that isn't something later? Because they may have a library like Alexandria or whatever. I'm not even dying on a hill here. I'm just saying they had sources. Right. They were working on ancient material here.
When you build a sandcastle, a hypothesis is built on a sandcastle like that, it's likely doomed to fail. And this is an example, in my view, of that happening. It's not looking like anywhere near what they imagined, which comes as of absolutely no surprise to me. Yeah. So when Jonathan came on your show and he was going for the coins and the Athena coin, that was interesting because Athena tends to be linked with Anat, a virgin Canaanite goddess of war. Now, when you look at the Elephantine papyri, what do we see? Anat Yahu, a consort of Yahweh. So this is a different goddess. It's not Asherah, who's typically the one imagined to be Yahweh's wife. If you read Margaret Barker's work, however, she suggests that it's really Yahweh's mother. And I suspect that was originally the case. But regardless, if you look at the Elephantine, what? I'm sorry?
Why can't it be mother and wife? Because that was a common way consorts operated.
Well, that's why I used the words originally the case. So when you look at the Elephantine papyri, Anat Yahu is Yahweh's wife. Well, Anat Yahu was Baal's wife, Baal-Hadad's wife in Canaan. And Baal-Hadad is the Canaanite version of Ishkar. So that gets into the whole Ishkar stuff. That's what I was talking about with you years ago. And it links very nicely with what I said there. So what I'm saying is, I mean, we have multiple examples in the ancient world where a goddess is the mother and wife of we have evidence of this where a goddess can be the mother and the wife of her son. That's happened before. It's not, I wouldn't say it's super common, but it happens. Sure, I wouldn't be the first case of something like that happening.
Again, one more comment on this. Sorry to derail, but I'm piggybacking on this position. And again, being autodidacts such as yourself and I, like, we're not PhDs, but there are academics who are like, man, you really know your stuff, right? They're like, you really have earned through your research and studying and reading these materials, countless materials, even though you don't have a specialty, right? You're right up there with a lot of these academic thinkers and stuff. And that's not to pretend that we're actual PhDs at all, but that we know what they're saying. We're hearing them out, and we like to buck against the consensus models because I don't think we're all there yet. It's all up in the air. There's no concrete data for a lot of it. But we've seen comment here real fast.
Yeah.
In this book, right? I'm reading Niels Peter Lemke, page 15 of this new book here he has, which for those who are just tuning in, he has a book. I'm going to interview him on Back to Reason, Minimalism and Biblical Studies. And I'm going to keep tapping from the Old Testament probably while you hit New Testament stuff. So he's talking about it can originate during the exile. Okay, talking about a moment of the idea of Israel is removed from history. We can no longer say with certainty that this idea originated in one period and not in another, because he's going through different scholars who suspect events in the biblical story are telling of post-exilic times, though they backdate them to Bronze Age, early Iron Age, whatever. And he's going through like, how do you know it's not Hellenistic? How can you say it's not Persian? How can you, if it can be flexibly interpreted much later, how do you anchor it? How do you know? He says there's no need, or there need not be any historical reality behind the notion of the 12 Israelite tribes. It can originate during the exile, in the Persian period, or in the Hellenistic period as well. Or it can be older. Its origin cannot be decided except in cases where the narratives about the 12 tribes of Israel can be dated. Maybe this is why Finkelstein is even now flirting with Hellenism in his recent collection of articles about Ezra and Nehemiah, Finkelstein 2018. So he wrote an article, which I read a while back, where even Finkelstein, who, this is like the head honcho archaeologist that a lot of people look to and go, this guy's great. He's flirting with Hellenistic, pushing stuff later into the Hellenistic period, specifically Ezra and Nehemiah. And anyway.
Yeah. It makes sense to me. And what I'll say is, just to come back to the Gospels, I noticed I didn't finish my thoughts on the Gospels. So I've consistently put the Gospels in the 2nd century for like 6 years now. I've been putting them in the 2nd century. It might have been longer than that.
Mark included, right?
Yeah. With Mark, it's slightly more complicated because I think Mark is written a couple of stages, because we're basically told that, actually. When you look at Papias, I know some are already looking at me sideways. Well, some people are going to be literally looking at me sideways after what's about to come out of my mouth. I don't really think that the Peter and Papias is the same one. Is the same one that I don't think it's the same guy that Kephas faced. I don't think it's the same as Cephas in the 30s that Paul faced up against. I do think it was the individual that canonical Paul or Saul of Giscala had contact with in the 90s. And I think that at the end of the 90s AD, the preaching of Peter was textualized, was put down into writing by Mark. Mark was supposed to be his son, and also known as John Mark. And Mark would later write an elaborated text, which I think became the Mark with the short ending. So basically our Gospel of Mark without the long ending. I would say that was in the early 2nd century. And Epiphanius then talks about another version of Mark that was produced a little later than that. That has a different beginning. This other version of Mark, Epiphanius says, began with Luke chapter 3, verse 1. It talks about Jesus in the 15th. Well, John the Baptist in the 15th year of Emperor Tiberius. So that's how it starts, just like Luke 3:1. So this new edition of Mark was the one that Luke used as a source. Even Epiphanius says he wrote, Luke added a beginning before the beginning.
Dude, just so you know, this is really interesting, but it's such a mess.
It is.
Because my question, and this comes back to the entire title of this video, why scholars never agree about the Bible. How many scholars agree with you that Cephas is not the same as Peter? How many scholars think that it was written post 70 AD? You see what I'm saying?
Just to clarify, I really mean more like Papias is Peter, but yeah, it's there are scholars that are moving into that direction. Samuel Zinner, we both interviewed him. He puts Mark in the 90s, Matthew, Luke, and John in the 2nd century. Practically the same views I have on the Gospels. We got Marcus Vincent, all the Gospels in the 2nd century. You've got David Trobisch, all the Gospels in the 2nd century. And Bartosz Adamczewski, he's another one that I've had on, puts all the Gospels in the 2nd century.
Do you feel the Gospels are the last stand of Rome, and the barbarians, Vincent and others, are chipping away from the outskirts with the radical views, and they're fighting to try and maintain we need to keep these in the 1st century, and I don't know, I'm just throwing a funny question.
I think that's probably the right way of putting it. Marcus Vincent says something else. I agree with him, but for different reasons. He says that there's an earlier collection of Paul's letters that predates Marcion's Paul. Now, when he says that, he of course is saying that Marcion's Paul came before canonical Paul. I don't agree. I think Marcion was cutting down canonical Paul, but nonetheless, I agree with him that there was an earlier collection of Paul that predates Marcion's Paul and canonical Paul, because I think Clement's the one that knew about it.
Nina Livesey's work. You're making me think of the chronology of when some of the stuff was written. One of the questions that I had, and I didn't bring it up because it's something that needs to be worked out. We talked about this prior to the episode that we discussed certain details. My concern was she has this idea that the Paul of Acts was such a juggernaut of a character that he inspired myths or legends about him, and even inspired a school like Marcion's school, or people right there at the time or before Marcion, to craft philosophical Christian letters in the name of this fictional character from Acts. My mind immediately goes, whoa, this is really cool how you painted this chronology, but Luke Acts, my understanding is dependent on Mark. And Mark, many scholars have written, shows a lot of affinities, similarities, overlap with Paul's letters. So how do you work out this chronology? If Mark is typically understood Mark in priority, which maybe that isn't the case, but I'm just saying Mark in priority, later we get Luke Acts, then your chronology is that later after that, we get the letters of Paul. How do we handle that Luke Acts is dependent on Mark if Paul's letters have so much in common with Mark? I don't know if I hope I'm not confusing anyone. I wish I could draw an image to help people understand.
No, I get what you're saying.
I know what you know, but I want to make sure the audience knows. Mark supposedly comes first, then you get Luke Acts, then in her view, you get Paul's letters.
Paul.
But Paul's letters have a lot in common with before Luke Acts over here with Mark. So how do we fix this chronology to make the best sense out of it and still keep her hypothesis? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. With me, it's not. I don't have that issue because I still put Paul's letters before Mark, so Mark knows Paul's letters. I think the Gospels know. I think all the Gospels know Paul's letters.
Yeah.
But her position is different. She puts Paul's letters after the Gospels, so she dates the letters of Paul like 50 years later than I do. 40, 50 years later. I can meet her halfway by saying I do agree that there is definitely post-war language in the letters because they post-date the first Jewish-Roman war. I just can't take the leap that it's after Bar Kokhba. I think that by the time you get to the Bar Kokhba revolt, you've got the Gospel of John coming out. I believe John, exactly as the anti-Marcionite prologue to John states, that John dictated to Papias the Gospel. This is consistent with what you see at the end of John in John 21. We know his testimony is true. That's an admission that the Gospel of John was written by a group of people, more than one person.
How do we know who those group is in John's
Right.
Gospel?
I guess one can't say we know, but I will say I believe, as the words I'll use, that the anti-Marcionite prologue is correct. That it
When was that
was
written?
John and Papias. It's chaotically dated. Some put it in the 2nd century. Some put it in the 3rd. Some put it in the 4th.
Right.
There's no exact agreement on it. I do think at least some scholars have put it in the 2nd century. The reason I believe it is, to me, it's a strange story to make up. I'll tell you why. Because it's especially what it says at the end. It absolutely contradicts the idea that John's an eyewitness document. There's just no way it doesn't come out, and it's embarrassing. It says that Marcion read the autographed copy of the Gospel of John. How do I know it says that? It's because it says when John finished writing it, Marcion read it. And Marcion was upset.
They might be making stuff up here in some way to get Marcion. I mean, I imagine there's so many ways to possibly interpret the point.
I suppose, but to me, I think it's easier to say it happened that way. And Marcion, this might actually help explain Marcion's theology. We see Johannine-like ideas in Marcion's antithesis, but the way that Marcion talks about Jews and the Jewish God is like taking certain things that's in the Gospel of John and just just making it worse, putting it on steroids. Because in John, when it says you are of your father of the devil, John 8:4. So in Marcion's gospel, Yahweh is evil. Jesus is, in the antithesis, excuse me. In the antithesis, Yahweh is evil. So the Jewish God is false, and Jesus is the son of a more merciful God. Right. So he's taking what the Gospel of John is saying in his antithesis and going further. But in his gospel, he cuts down Luke. So that's the way I look at it. At the moment, I don't find it convincing that it happened in any other way right now. Open to it, of course.
I want to thank you for that language for the viewer.
Yeah.
Understand that, like, we're going to keep changing our minds.
Yeah.
We're going to keep learning but anyway, yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that gives the patristic hypothesis an edge, just for those that don't know, the patristic hypothesis is the position that Marcion cut down Luke. That's what that means. So if you look at Marcion's gospel, and from the reconstructions that I know about, this appears to be consistent, and that is Marcion's gospel doesn't have brothers and sisters of Jesus. Now, of course, if Jesus was born in heaven and he ascended from heaven down to earth, which is what Marcion suggests in the antithesis, of course he can't have biological brothers and sisters. That's out the window. So he removes all those references to them when he cuts down Luke. As Tertullian says, that Marcion wrote his gospel not with a pen, but with a sword, because he just cut out the gospel he wanted from an existing gospel. And that makes sense to me. So when I look at Luke, so I do think Luke knew Matthew. I also think Matthew and Luke knew an earlier edition of Thomas, rather as opposed to Q. I use Thomas instead to explain it. Now, Thomas only contains about 20-30% of Q, so it obviously can't be Q, okay? But when you look at Thomas, you do see this alternating primitivity that's supposed to be in Q. Like,
So when you say if you were to know, you're talking about common material between Matthew and Luke.
Yes.
Okay.
So, but Thomas does have blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew has blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens. Luke drops in spirit. So there in that part, Luke's closer to Thomas, but he changes kingdom of heaven to kingdom of God. Now, typically, kingdom of God is believed to be the more primitive version that they imagine to be in Q. But when you look at Thomas, which appears to be the reality of it to me, it is kingdom of heaven. That's the problem with that guesswork, is that the truth isn't going to be quite, or at least what I think is the truth, isn't going to be quite what they imagined was in a hypothetical document that they have no evidence of. As Bartosz Chesky says in his book, Q or Not Q, and he also said this to me in an interview. Well, I don't remember if he put it this way in the book, but I think he did. But he definitely did this on the interview. Scholars are reconstructing a text, a critical edition of a text that doesn't exist. I just had to laugh because that's literally what they're doing. So what I think is happening is Thomas obviously can't explain the entire double tradition. So in order to explain the double tradition, Matthew and Luke use Thomas, and whatever Matthew and Luke didn't get from the other, got from the other. So in other words, Luke finished the job by getting the rest of it from Matthew, or it's the reverse. Matthew finished the job by getting the rest of it from Luke. But either way, one used the other to get the rest of the double tradition.
Okay. So, all right, it's a mess. Let's just call it a mess, because I've heard this before too. Many scholars have come on. I've even had like a debate between Mark Goodacre and Dennis McDonald. And some of the interesting criticisms I have that I've watched and listened is, well, this is more primitive than that. And I'm like, how do you know? How do you know? Even when, and I don't want to get lost in the sauce here. I want to get back to the bigger picture. The satellite view of asking about scholars here is this. You brought up, Tertullian talks about he used a sword to cut up the Gospel of Luke to make his own gospel. And many other scholars will point out that it's, more likely you start with the primitive and then people build on. So it's more common they add material to existing text than it is you cut material. Statistically, more material in the ancient world would have been cut. Not cut, added onto, rather than you just cutting out and creating.
But abridging did happen in the ancient world, though. It did happen. Abridging did happen in the ancient world.
Yeah. But we talked about this on the phone before too. Yeah, and it's also more common though that they add rather than cut. So what I'm saying is you can accept Tertullian, and I'm sure there's arguments within the text that makes them go, looks like Marcion cut this stuff out. I've heard M. David Litlow make his arguments in the opposite view, where he's like, no, all the reasons for why they added a Marcion trying to tamper and tame, Judaize, if you will, Marcion's gospel, and tame his gospel, because his virality within Christendom was literally catching fire and people were becoming Marcionites left and right. So they had to politically make a power move by manipulating his gospel. Now you can accept Tertullian, you can accept Marcion. Here's the deal. All I'm saying as a non-expert who does not know these languages and has not dug into this, I'm only interviewing scholars, is I sit back, grab my bag of popcorn metaphorically and say, you know what? Look at what these brilliant minds who will know more about this than I ever will. And they will not and cannot agree. And they're arguing over minutia down to the grammar and the syntax. And I'm sitting here going, amazing how brilliant minds can never really figure out and solve all this material. So why can't we have our own guesses of what we think makes the most sense? What's the problem here? You know what I mean?
But I'll bring up two more things. Two more problems I have with Marcion priority over Luke, or Marcion priority as in Marcion being before the canonical Gospels. Papias seems to know nothing about it. Now, I know that we're missing damn near everything Papias wrote, but what we do have that did survive and it seems very obvious that the text of Papias that did survive was mostly selected, not just preserved just by happenstance. Papias refers to Judas's death in his text that did survive. So he knows Acts. He's getting that from Acts. Now, you could take Dennis McDonald's position because he flips it. He has Luke knowing Papias. But anyway, I don't agree with that. I think Papias knew Acts, which is usually the view of that many other scholars happen to many scholars happen to have. So they take so I think Acts was known to Papias, but Papias doesn't seem to know or hint that he knows a gospel similar to Luke, distinct from the tradition of Acts.
Does Papias even mention Luke?
No,
I've heard scholars say no.
No. But what I'm trying to say is, let me try to put this in another way. It doesn't seem to me
Papias as well. I mean, that's a whole nother.
Yeah, I mean, Papias can be variously dated, although I think it's AD 130s, especially if the anti-Marcionite prologue is to be believed. I would say about 135 AD, thereabouts. Now, I think that the second problem, I would say this position is more concrete. If Luke knew Marcion's gospel, the faithfulness gets real strange. I'll tell you what I mean. Then that would mean Luke is faithful to Marcion's gospel in a way he wasn't even with Mark and Matthew. It's a strange thing. It's just Luke basically just plagiarized Marcion's gospel word for word all over the place and just added some stuff from Mark and Matthew that he wanted to jam in there. I suppose that's possible, but I just don't think that's likely right now. I just don't think that's likely. I think it's easier to say that Marcion cut down Luke because he wanted to remove things that didn't fit his theology. After all, I don't think it was common for church fathers to claim that a text was cut down. I think that was actually unusual. Even the earlier church fathers would not say the Hebrew gospel was cut down from canonical Matthew. They would say the Hebrew gospel was in fact older. It's not until we get much later in the game where they try to make more difficult arguments to deal with the Hebrew gospel that they did not like.
Does Marcion say they added to his gospel?
Does Marcion say that?
Yeah, does Marcion hint that they manipulated his?
Tertullian says that Marcion claimed that he was plagiarized, but Marcion published his gospel after he was already plagiarized, which is strange because it kind of makes it would make his gospel both the first and the last. Wouldn't this to you, if you weren't like leaning into a particular hypothesis, be more agnostic about this? Because I don't know if one side's saying they plagiarized me, Marcion, if the other side's saying he cut down our text, unless I have better evidence, I'm just going to be more like, who knows? I can hypothesize in both directions and not take a position. For me, that's just, I'm more cautious in thinking, why should I trust church fathers? Are we not starting with this assumption that we should believe these particular Christians over other Christians that ended up getting the worst view? Those are heretics. It's easy to blame them or accuse them instead of going, they're both saying there's accusations in both directions. I need better empirical data to prove one came before the other and redacted the other or added to the other instead. That's kind of where I'm at. Well, I would say the biggest reason I believe that Marcion's gospel cut down Luke is when I look at the gospel and I see that Jesus has no brothers and sisters. And I can totally see how that would work better with the idea that Marcion removed those references in order so that he could say in his separate text that Jesus came out of heaven and then claim, hey, my gospel shows that Jesus wasn't born. It doesn't explicitly state it. It doesn't explicitly state he had brothers and sisters either.
let me add to this. Let me give a reverse effect. I could also
Okay.
just as likely see them adding brothers to remove any of this potential docetism of Jesus not in the flesh. So we need to guarantee he's in the flesh by having brothers and sisters to make him on earth and not a phantom figure or some type of ghost or some spirit being instead. So all I'm saying is, and by the way, anyone who's watching, me and Jacob are like brothers. So he'll call me and we will go back and forth and have these little scuffles. They're brotherly scuffles, but they're scuffles of going like, well, what about this, man? Well, hold on. Can't you think the reverse is possible? And so I'm just giving an example of how we would do that on the phone. I could see the reverse just as likely in my mind of saying, yeah, they're historicizing, they're Judaizing. They want to get him away from this Platonic philosophical doceticism. And I still feel like, okay, you can play both scenarios and think through both being likely.
Right.
You know what I mean? This is
the
me.
one thing I want to say is, I used to get some people saying to me, "Oh, Jacob, you think canonical Paul's written in the 80s, 90s? Then there was no historical Jesus." I'm like, what? Okay, let's slow down. For problem with scholars is they never fully agree with me on the Bible.
I just thought that was a funny comment I had.
But just to finish what I was saying, that was funny. When I look at, hold on, I kind of lost where I was at.
I'm sorry. We were dealing with Marcion priority. We're dealing with like all this, and then I'm not sure exactly where you were going with it. I jumped in a couple times to get pushback on certain views to give the alternative.
Okay, I remember now. I was talking about Paul and how Paul's letters being later doesn't mean there was no Jesus. That's where I was going with that. So Paul never met Jesus. I would say none of the three Pauls met Jesus. And when you look at Galatians, and it talks about the Lord's brother, it's interesting because I have had discussions behind the scenes. A friend of mine who also another friend of mine who doesn't think that the brother of the Lord in Galatians is the same as the historical James, who is the Lord's brother, which is also my view. The reason I think that is because Paul attacked James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, now this is in the Clementine Recognitions, which is typically dated way later.
Of course.
But I don't completely buy it. I'm with some of the more radical scholars on the issue that think that significant portions of the recognitions are early. Origen in the 3rd century, yeah, that's Origen. For those that didn't catch that, I'm saying Origen. But Origen in the 3rd century does know the Clementine Recognitions. He doesn't call it that. He calls it the 10 books of the Travels of Clement. That's what he calls it.
10 books of what?
The Travels of Clement.
Okay.
So it's 10 volumes, just like the Recognitions. One of the stories that certain scholars like Jeffrey Butts believe represents a very old tradition is Saul's attack upon James, the brother of Jesus. Now, here's the issue. This is one of the reasons why I do not buy at all that this is a later made-up story. It complicates things on numerous levels. Not only to have Paul attack James. That's the same one that Clement's talking about. The second thing is when it happened. This will get back to the beginning of this discussion when I was putting Paul in the AD 30s. It's one of the reasons I do this. The Clementine Recognition states that it happened under Caiaphas and Gamaliel. Now,
the attack by Paul on James happened under Caiaphas and Gamaliel.
Now, when were those two in power simultaneously? I can tell you. From the year 30 to 36 AD. So that means it was within those years. Now, when we look at the Gospel of Thomas, there's a couple of things in there that's very interesting. Jesus says to his disciples when they ask him, who will take your place when you go? And he says to them, look to James the just, for whose sake the heavens and the earth were made.
It's kind of a big deal.
That's kind of a very interesting statement in the 12th saying in the Gospel of Thomas.
It's in saying 12?
Yes. And Thomas says later on in the Gospel that John the Baptist is the greatest and none will be greater than him. Now, this fits Josephus, dare I say. I'll explain why. Yeah,
Just
go to saying 12.
Disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you will depart from us. Who will be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "Wherever you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being."
Yes.
Awesome.
That's right. So this represents a tradition, a very old tradition, that James is important. He succeeded Jesus, as several scholars point out, as Robert Eisenman has pointed out. But here's the problem, right? The elephant in the room. Josephus says James died in AD 62. There are scholars that will use this very text to argue. They will use the Clementine recognitions, the very thing that they diss and dismiss, to dismiss Josephus, which is hella ironic. Because Josephus, they say it's an interpolation. I say it's authentic. I think Josephus wrote the entire James passage. But,
just so we're on the same page, we know the Testimonium Flavianum. We know the Antiquities 20, where it mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ, right? That passage, or are you talking about the one where it says James is killed?
The James passage, where Josephus talks about James being the brother of Jesus, called Christ, and that he was killed by Ananus ben Ananus, the high priest of Jerusalem, or Hanan ben Hanan in Hebrew. So what's happening is, in my view, even though I think Josephus wrote all of that, it's not the same person.
So that's a different James in your view than Thomas is James the Just, or James the brother of the Lord.
A different human being. I think, what I think's going on is this is the one that the apocalypses of James are talking about. The first apocalypse of James states that that James is not the physical brother of Jesus, but spiritually his brother. And the second apocalypse, Theuda, a man called Theuda, is identified as his father.
Oh,
so I think,
real quick, James is Jacob. Just so viewers know, this is a common name, common Jewish name. So it's not like ridiculous to think you'd have multiple James, right? Am I correct? It's Jacob, James.
Yeah, there's multiple Jameses. You have James, the son of Zebedee, and Acts.
I'm saying, isn't the name James? Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't the name James also kind of like Joshua is Jesus?
Yeah, James is a common name. Exactly. Okay. Jacob is a common name. Yes. Yeah. So I think that, I think what's happening is that after James's death in 36 AD is when I think it happened. Then this is the interesting thing. John the Baptist is usually seen as the successor, but as the Gospel of Thomas is insinuating, John's afterwards, just like Josephus also suggests. John the Baptist dies after Jesus. And when you look at the Gospel of Thomas, James is the one that will be Jesus' immediate successor. But John is also greatest, which means John is also in line to succeed, but he wasn't picked to be the immediate successor. So that means whenever James goes, it would fall to John if John was still around to succeed him, which he was. Some scholars, like Samuel Zinner, will say that Josephus wrote the Testimonium because why would you place the Testimonium before the John passage, which turns the Gospels chronology on its head? I agree with him because I think it's the Gospels that are turning the chronology on its head. They're making John lesser than Jesus. They're getting John to praise Jesus. When you look at the Gospel of Thomas, what I think are the authentic portions of it, John is the one being praised by Jesus instead. John is greater than me. And this is consistent with what you see in Josephus, in my view.
Okay, so this is a whole lot of...
Oh, yeah.
I'm trying to think through all sorts of stuff here. So, okay, I want to come back. I want to back up because I think you and I are going to get into Paul. We're going to dive into some of the weeds pertaining to this stuff. Again, to the general title of this video. Why scholars never agree about the Bible. Generically, can you speak on this? What you've noticed in interviewing 150 scholars? I mean, you probably interviewed 100 to 150 different academics over the years. What is the problem? What are you seeing that is happening in the field? From a autodidact, you're not trained up to have to be in a particular school, but that doesn't mean you don't have bias. Of course, we all do.
Yeah, I think everyone has a bias indeed. It's unavoidable. What I will say is it's hard. I think it's a little hard to describe, but I will try. I think the first thing, that's the easiest and simplest thing to say, is that scholars are caught up in different schools of academic thought. I understand. I mean, when one could be following the footsteps of their doctoral supervisor and be very biased for that person's position against those who are contrary. And when somebody puts something down in a book, they're not likely to change their mind either. I'm just going to be real. When someone puts something down in a book, they are likely, I'm not saying they're not going to, okay, because some people, it's happened, but they're likely not going to change their minds. They're going to be very ferocious in defending what they've written. I mean, there are scholars that have insulted and attacked others for disagreeing with them. It's terrible when this happens, but they've done this. We've seen this. Some will get so vitriolic as to attack other people for saying you shame PhDs or your PhD's fake. We've seen this. Things will get way out of control. And somebody needs to get in the middle, like, okay, push it back, stop. Let's stop boxing over here again. It's too hard, it's too much. Stop it, break it up. But we've seen these dramas, too many of them, and it's weird how they're getting into such childish modes of argumentation on texts that were written by people that have been dead for thousands of years.
Yeah,
I'm like, why are we acting like this over these extremely ancient documents?
I was going to add in the religious factor that I can't imagine
yes,
is an elephant in the room as well. Yeah. So we have a lot of academics who are motivated in some way, whether conscious or unconscious, through the religious journey they're on. And so it's difficult for them to potentially even entertain some of the more radical views. Some I've heard say, I believe one thing, but I know in my historical research another. And I'm like, how they compartmentalize is a shocker to me. But I imagine that plays a role. And still in the opposite angle, for those who don't believe, who have a critical lens, right? Like me, for example, I can imagine I have a bias, right? When I'm approaching material where, there were times where I'd say, I'm not listening to these academics over here. They're PhDs, but they're conservative scholars, right? But I do want to hear what they have to say. That doesn't mean you can't learn something from them. And there's a lot of material that you go, whoa, I never heard that before. That's interesting. So I'm just trying to point out the various things on why scholars may never agree about the Bible, whether it be religious, non-religious, or again, there's tribalism in the school of thought. There are other ways in which they may not realize some of their methods might be circular reasoning. That's the kind of trouble I get into when I'm not the guy who's saying it. I get in trouble for being the messenger or highlighting it on my channel. And I say I'm getting in trouble because a lot of scholarly friends of mine will write, hey, we don't like this. We don't like that you're not a PhD. You have a lot of blind spots, Derek. I get that. But I guess so does Gad Barnea or Jonathan or, all of these experts that I think are at least asking very important questions and not doing dating that's circular Old Testament stuff or even New Testament stuff. How do we know? I don't want to give like a deep dive answer to this, Jacob, but how can we know Mark was written in 75 AD or right there in the 70s? How can we know it wasn't written in the 90s?
You can't.
This is so the debate is necessary and important. And in fact, no one should be too dogmatic if someone is trying to debate these things, unless dogma gets in the mix, unless tradition, I imagine, comes in, because then that's the faith that kind of drives maybe, oh, no, we got to push this back, because Mark was literally writing Peter's sermons. You see, and now we got Peter's sermons. Well, Peter was down here, unless they want to argue that Mark wrote a couple decades later all these sermons he had memorized, or they had orally, or whatever.
Like I said earlier, I don't even think Papias as Peter is even the same Peter that was living in the early 1st century. I just think it's a different guy with the same name.
So there's,
so it's just
you see the mess, though?
To me. Yeah, it is. It's, in a way, it's what's happening is it's basically, when you look at the Epistle of James, let me just give this as an example. James chapter 5, verse 6. I use this as evidence to show that even though it looks like James in the Clementine recognition survived the attack, he does get killed shortly thereafter. Because in the Epistle of James, I actually think was written by a dude called James, because it says so at the very beginning. It's very interesting. It says, he introduces himself as James, a follower, not brother, a follower of Lord Jesus Christ. So he's like, I'm not going to claim to be his brother. There's some other guy called James, which I don't have a problem believing. I think the fact that he doesn't even claim to be the brother is why I think the argument is ridiculous that this document was written by James, brother of Jesus. Because James was such a common name that I think it's conceivable that he has the same name and he wrote this letter. But at the same time, he took advantage of the fact he had the same name. This is a different way of creating. It's more like a spiritual quasi-forgery, if you get where I'm going with this. It's like, okay, I happen to have his name, so I will liken myself to this man named James. And in James 5:6, he's writing against canonical Paul, who's pretending to be the Paul that's at James. It's funny. So if you look at James 5:6, he says, you killed the righteous one who doth not resist you. Oh, like the guy in the Clementine recognitions was killed. So what's happening is, I think the Epistle of James is evidence that, yes, this aspect of the Clementine recognitions is super old. And I think that person knew about it. He knew about the situation, at least. And he is the James that was arguing with Paul in Galatians. So I had mentioned this recently, just so I can finish real quick. There's another problem. Corinthus. Irenaeus says that Corinthus and John the Presbyter are active in the 80-90s. And when you look at Corinthus, he goes into a bathhouse, and John the Presbyter is in the bathhouse. He's bathing. Corinthus enters. John gets the hell out of there. It says, I will not be near that impure man. Now, you might be thinking, what the hell does Corinthus have to do with Paul? Well, Epiphanius tells us something more. That Corinthus was the leader of the Galatian church. Excuse me? The leader of the Galatian church? Guess what else he says? Corinthus caused troubles in Galatia in Paul's day.
But this is Epiphanius?
Yeah, so he had sources that were telling him that Corinthus was opposing the person that was writing Paul's letters. Now, how does that work in putting Paul in the magical 80s, 50s, 40s, whatever? No, that doesn't make any sense. What about I could go to the Acts of Timothy. The Acts of Timothy that thinks that Timothy was killed in the late 80s, 90s. A lot of people don't know about that. Yeah. The Acts of Timothy thinks that Timothy, a major co-author, a major character in the Pauline corpus, was killed in the late 80s, 90s. Make that make sense to me. Why are we having evidence? Because it's adding up. It's not just Jerome anymore. We have other texts saying other characters interacting with Paul or involved in the composition of Paul's corpus are dying at the end of the 1st century. This is what I used to say years ago, and I came back to it because it's unavoidable. These questions need to be asked.
So that is an odd passage that you brought up in James 5, verse 6. Let me share that real quick for people. It's an odd thing to say. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence, which you have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. So I'm kind of wondering, if you take this literally, is all the money he's collecting from churches playing into his pocket? This cult leader named Paul. Granted, who knows if they're just working off of the letters or if there really is this historical kind of grounding to some of this. But what's interesting is you have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. At the very least, tells us there's some opposition going on here. And of course, many scholars think this James is like jabbing at the faith, the grace through faith stuff.
And let me note before you continue, but this letter is often dated to the 80-90s by scholarship. Continue.
No. I think this is interesting because what you find, like I know this is an analogy in the Old Testament, but we find this strange stuff in Genesis where sons of God marry daughters of men. You get this little hint and then boom, story's up. Not much data is like given to you. You get these little like little cliffhanger type legends. Enoch was taken he walked with God and then was not. And you're like, what? And if we're reading James as if there is something there's some earlier something, and then you find a tradition that's trying to say, hey, Paul actually killed the righteous James. Whoever wrote this forged letter in the name of James is saying you condemned him.
Right. It's another dude called James complaining to a dude pretending to be Paul because he changed his name from Saul to Paul. See, this is, I was talking about this to you on the phone before too, that in Philippians, because even in canonical Paul, I know Saul's name's not there, but even from canonical Paul, you can't get away from Saul. You go to Philippians. He says, I'm a Benjamite because he's linking himself with Saul. This is the same person, I believe, that Jerome is talking about. He went from Saul of Tarsus to becoming Paul. He changed his name. So that's why I said in Acts is talking about a pseudo-Paul in a sense, because he changed his name from Saul to Paul. If you look at 2 Thessalonians, canonical Paul is attacking the Paul that lived in the 30s AD. How do I know this? Because in 2 Thessalonians, he says, really, I should say they said, because it's three people writing 2 Thessalonians, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. Do not read letters that say something different as if it came from us. Not one, us, not me, us, plural. The group.
Right.
Because Paul's letter is written by a committee. 8 of them are co-authored. 8 out of 13 of Paul's letters are co-authored. It's a co-authored anthology. And these co-authors are not agreeing on every single jot and tittle. These are multi-authored, co-authored texts. They admit this. Most of the letters, 6 out of 8 of the letters are authored by 2 people. Not the same 2 people at all times, but Paul's involved in all of them. But sometimes it's with a different author, or like with 1 Corinthians, Sophanes is a co-author. 2 Corinthians, Timothy is a co-author. When you look at 1 and 2 Thessalonians, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. In Romans, it's Paul and Tertius. So all these letters are co-authored. The only ones that are not is Galatians, Ephesians, 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Interesting, isn't it? Those 5 are the only ones that are not co-authored. So, again, this explains, in my view, the different so-called styles and whatever the stuff that that is often complained about in terms of language of these texts and different theologies that seem to be self-contradictory. I think can be mostly explained by this, but what can't be explained as easily, unless you date the letters later, like I do, is the temporal tensions of the text, which we covered a bit earlier. Yeah. How does the text know the temple was destroyed? That's why I did a joke, because I did an AI-generated thumbnail where Saul is looking at a car, and it's titled "Back to the Christ," like Back to the Future, because he's getting in that car, and obviously there were no cars in Paul's day. He's getting into this car, He's going back to the future, then back to the he's going back to the past. He's going into the past, then back to the present, which is the future of the past. So that's the joke. And that's why I titled the video the way I titled it. I said in the title, how many Pauls? All or none?
Right. Okay. Couple super chats. I need to go to the restroom real quick here because I've been drinking lots of water. I'm gonna make you full screen and we'll go ahead and ask. You can click these, right? You know how to. Does it let you click on them?
Yeah. I mean, no, it does not. It's because I'm
first one up here because I know you have much to say on this, and I'll be right back.
Well, actually, I don't have a lot to say on this. The consensus dates Clement to the AD 90s. Now, I mean, I know I've spent much of the stream discussing views that I have that depart from the consensus. On this one, I agree with the consensus. I don't have a problem with the AD 90s dating. I know there are some scholars besides Dr. Carrier who thinks that First Clement is early. If I remember correctly, the argument has to do with sacrifices in the temple still going on. But I think the other problem that I have with the main issue I have with it is it seems to know about additional persecutions. I do not buy that the Domitianic persecution against Christians was a myth. I think that actually happened. I didn't even get into that very much in this stream. It's one of the other reasons I date Paul's letters later in time, later in the first century. Yeah. Let's see. I already answered the super chat. You can head on to the next one.
Cool. Not sure how to pronounce your name. Thank you for the super chat. Is it Eaton Altman? Eaton? Either way. Thank you for the super chat. In my opinion, it's difficult to main the patristic hypothesis given the data science, meaning it looks conclusive that Acts author is not the same as most of Luke.
I agree. I think that's probably the case. I actually think Luke the Evangelist is the Marcionite named Lucan. Lucan was a disciple of Marcion in the AD 130s. And I think he actually is the one that wrote canonical Luke Acts. I would say what I didn't get into earlier in the stream is I am somewhat sympathetic to the idea that Marcion's text could look like it predates Luke, because there's a position called the similar hypothesis. The similar hypothesis is the idea that rather than Marcion cutting down Luke, it's a cut down proto-Luke. Now, I don't like hypothetical documents. So if some of y'all caught on to how I do things earlier, you must be saying, Jacob, did you find a document or church father that attests to this? It's not that I found anything new, but there is a church father text that says this. It's pseudo-Tertullian. Pseudo-Tertullian states that Curdon, also known as Curdo, a Gnostic or Surdo, had a smaller version of Luke in his possession, in which it lacked the infancy narrative. Since we're told this, I think he wrote basically all of Luke, with the exception of the first 2 chapters. Lucan reacts by composing longer Luke with the first 2 chapters added, and then the rest, and then he writes all of Acts. That's my position. Both versions of these texts know Matthew. So in the end, it's basically the thorough hypothesis of an extra step, if you want to look at it that way. But they're both using Matthew as far as I'm concerned. Curdo the Gnostic is using the other Mark that's using short ending of Mark that has a different beginning on it that matches Luke 3:1. That's a mouthful. But anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you. Carbon. The early church said the world would end in the 6th century. Why does nobody talk about this? I mean,
listen, these people kept thinking it would end in every single century they were in, nonstop. So it's ridiculous. Again, the apocalypse is always postponed every time it doesn't happen when expected. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah.
Oh, it's spiritually happened, guys. You can't see it.
By the way, there's around 1000 AD, almost 1,000 years after Jesus, Christians thought this is it, the millennium, right? The end of the 1,000 years. Yeah. Satan will be released. It's going to be the end. It's going to be chaos. So there's a lot of this that's happened throughout history. I think you and I know I've been doing some videos I'm crafting together now on failed apocalyptic material and stuff, but I haven't dealt with the 6th century, but it's a common trope. Thank you, Carbon. Eddie Moretti, thank you for the super chat. Would you guys want to debate Christian apologists on the utility versus the truth content of Christianity? I think this is in the vein of, would you want to debate on the idea of, like, even if it isn't isn't true, does it have utility? Is it pragmatic that people should follow this religion, even if you say at the end of the day it's not true? Or maybe the super chatters.
So in other words, should people be cultural Christians?
Yeah, should you be a Christian for the ethical, communal kind of how it, not because it's true, but I suspect
I would definitely have a problem with that. I would oppose it. So I guess I would.
They're asking, would you?
I guess that's what I'm saying. I guess I would do it. Yeah, I would oppose it.
Okay.
I would oppose that position, so I would debate it.
Eddie, thank you for the super chat. Adam S. in the house with a 10. Thank you for the super chat. Does serial killer Saul, who changed his name to Paul, pursues his readers to kill them all? Romans 1:32, and was Paul mentally ill?
I think he meant to spell persuades there. I forgot a letter.
Oh, persuades.
But I think canonical Paul was a little on the crazy side. But at the same time, he kind of purposefully has to be. And I believe it was either in 1st or 2nd Corinthians, can't remember. Paul says, I am all things to all men. I cannot stand it when people try to defend Paul there and say that doesn't mean a liar. Because if I said that, they would call me a liar. That's what liars do. They tell one thing to one person, do another, and another. So that way, the truth is fluidic and subjective, and they can bend over, or they can change their position anytime they want. In Romans 3, Paul justifies lying. I think it's in Romans 3:5, for the glory of God. If I abound people for my falsehood to the glory of God. Oh, okay, so lying's cool then. That's great.
Yeah, but if our unrighteousness brings out God's right, and this is NIV, so God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we
keep
say?
Reading the Romans 3:7 though? It gets worse.
Yeah.
If my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? And that's identical in the other translation, so that doesn't really matter here. So, yeah, so it's cool to say BS as long as it abounds to the glory of God and enhances the glory of God. This fits the language that we see in, I think it's in 1 Corinthians. I'm going to look it up. Like, I can't stand that. I can't remember. All things to all men. It's in 1 Corinthians 9:22. I'm all things to all men. So that fits what we see in Romans chapter 3. If through falsehoods I bring people to the glory of God, then I'm cool. Again, I mean,
I think Paul's saying here that, like, he's not persuading people to kill. I think he's just echoing something.
Yeah,
the moral.
I think I agree with you there. I don't think he's trying to, because canonical Paul,
he's just saying they deserve death, right? That's what I think is that they deserve.
Well, it could definitely. It could. Well, this is as far as I'll go. he won't tell his followers explicitly to commit violence. So he'll toe the line and say, oh, they deserve death, but he's not going to say, but I want you to cause it. He'll hold back and not go all the way. That's how I feel is going on here. So he's kind of tiptoeing here. But canonical Paul is not, I'll say he's not as violent of an individual as the Paul that he's sanitizing and altering in these texts. Because the one in the AD 30s, super violent man, he attacked James for crying out loud. Really, the moment they attacked James, the gig was up. Because I think the original Paul was a Herodian, and he was trying to I think he was trying to get people to get along, and then he lost it and attacked James. And after he attacked James, it's over. It's over. What's he going to do? Is he really going to have an argument like we see in Galatians? Hell no. No one's going to take him seriously after that. He attacked James, the Lord's brother. It's over.
So
the story's done.
So I'm on the same page here. The tradition we have that before he converts, he is a persecutor of the church. This is when you would insert his killing of James, his fighting of James.
His so-called pseudo conversion, because I don't think his conversion was really real. It's because he was doing it. He was doing it to try to manipulate and to bring people to trying to stop rebellion, trying to stop troubles, because there was all kinds of crap happening in the AD 30s. Things were heating up then, and this would eventually lead to the Jewish War. So 40 years later. So about 40 years later. So what happens here is Paul just decided to attack James. So he's not going. So Paul decides, I'm not going to waste my time with arguments like the later canonical Paul will. He's just going to attack the guy. Yeah. He's like, he wants James dead. He wants him out of here. He's not dealing with this anymore. And then after that happened, see, if you look at 2 Corinthians, canonical Paul says he fled from King Aretas. 2 Corinthians 11. Well, that's ridiculous. How could a dude flee from Aretas in the AD 90s in the AD 30s? He's writing these letters with Timothy and these other people. I remember doing a show with John Kloppenborg years ago. I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but I'll get it in order. Just give me a second. I had John Kloppenborg on a couple years ago to talk about the redating of Erastus, the Erastus inscription. Originally, the Erastus inscription was dated to the AD 50s and used as evidence that, hey, we have archaeological evidence that Erastus, the treasure man that Paul talks about in Romans, existed. One problem, though, it was redated. It's actually Hadrianic era. Oh, well, all of a sudden, it's not the same Erastus. It is the same Erastus. You dated the letters wrong. That's what happened. I'm talking about the date. The letters were dated wrong. So if you move the letters later to the AD 90s, it makes sense. You can have Erastus feasibly being alive in the 90s and the 140s, unless you wish Erastus to be a 90 or 100-year-old man, or even older than that, which is ridiculous.
Right.
But no, if you move the letters later, it solves these problems. And the original Paul living in the 30s, Paul the Herodian, would know nothing of Erastus. Never met the guy. They don't know each other. It was a different guy. Totally different situation, different time period. And if you look at 1 Clement, Paul goes furthest west of the empire, right? Now, why was he taken furthest west of the empire? Read Josephus. What does Josephus say? Multiple people in the AD 30s, the late AD 30s, were removed from power because the Roman administration was disappointed in them. Caiaphas was removed as high priest. Okay? Pontius Pilate was removed as prefect. Herod Antipas, the tetrarch, was removed as tetrarch. He was then exiled to Spain by AD 39. He was exiled to Spain. And I think that means Paul, I think Herod Antipas took Paul with him to Spain, where Paul dies. What I suspect, as Oscar Coleman says, in 1930, he was killed by other believers. Oscar Coleman suggests that Paul, based on 1 Clement, was killed by rival believers. And I think he's right. And
There's a violent streak, huh?
yeah, let me give you my hypothesis. If I had to guess why he was killed, it's because of what he did to James. He was hunted down. Took him 3 years to find him, and they found him and whacked him in Spain. That was the end of it. So that's why I think Paul probably died not long after he got there, 39 AD, and he's out of the picture. And like I said, look at 1 Clement, look at the Acts of Paul, look at Jerome. We're given 3 different chronologies about Paul here. Okay? That's what these texts are saying. That's the problem here. There's all kinds of issues across the map here. And that's what I'm trying to show here. Somebody said Paul didn't write Hebrew. Yeah, I know that. I think almost no scholar believes Paul wrote Hebrews. Hebrews talks about Jesus being a high priest, which is the language you see in 1 Clement. I remember Origen of Alexandria saying that either Clement or Luke wrote Hebrews, but only God knows. It's an interesting statement from Origen.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect he probably got it right that it was Clement, but at the same time, I can see a case being made that it was Luke. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Next super chat, the mother frickin' Windyberg in the house. Thank you for the super chat. Love the name and being a member. What were all the common J names if there was no J in the ancient Hebrew alphabet? This gets into
I know where this is going. Some people say, Jesus didn't exist because the letter J doesn't exist in Hebrew. Come on. It's Yeshua. Okay, his name was Yeshua in Hebrew. What's the big deal? J is English, okay?
So Greek, Latin, and Y in Hebrew.
Yeah, right. That's my point. So, I see John White in the chat. He says, Jacob, you're firing facts. Thank you, John. I want to have you on again, man. We gotta get you back on. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't make to me, it's not a big deal that there's no J in the Hebrew alphabet. So what? I mean, this is just translation. I think
it's sometime after like the 14th century or something. The long I, the hooked I, starts to take on the J. But it's a later thing, and so we're just translating a Bible from Greek or Hebrew into English, and so that's where we get the J, Jacob, James, Jesus. But it's I or Y, something to this effect linguistically. So thank you, mother frickin' Windyberg, for being here.
That's an awesome name.
Yeah. Gay Royale, just for in giggles, what is your definition of a Christian?
Oh, that question, huh? I mean, I guess anybody that believes in Christ in some kind of way and thinks he rose from the dead, I guess that's a Christian. But there are people that call each other false Christians, or like, you don't believe it in the way I do. That's why I don't like this kind of question. I get why I get why this question is being asked, but I'm like, that's such a hairy, tricky situation to try to answer.
Right. Like I've heard people go, well, there's people who go, why would you say someone's not a Christian? For me, I'm like, I guess in my mind, if I'm going to give you my 2 cents, it would just be, if you don't believe any of this stuff, like you have no dogma, you don't believe the creeds really are true or anything like that, you don't believe the miracles or anything like that, it's difficult for me. I mean, I guess if you want to call yourself Christian, go for it. It's just like, at what point do you need to be called a Christian any longer when you don't think these things are true? In the literal sense that they never happened. Yeah. There was no resurrection. There was no virgin birth. There was no, you name it. And I guess you're welcome to say I'm a Christian for whatever reason. I don't want to draw that line, but tell me that's not, it feels odd to me. But that's because I come from a Christianity that said, no, we believe in the Trinity. We believe in a virgin birth. We believe the stories that are written, we believe those are literally true. And so that's the kind of Christianity I came out of. So it's hard for me to wrap my head around.
But the term Christian, and this will be the last thing I say to address this question, there's no strong evidence of the term Christian being used until the AD 90s. There have been arguments that there have been attempts to try to date the term Christianos earlier, but I haven't personally found those arguments convincing. I think it's a term that emerges in the 90s. Yeah.
Anyway, this is a bit anachronistic, but like that's just what we understand Christians to be. Again, there were some pretty radical, different kinds of Christians in the early second century.
Yeah.
Jason,
the first Paul.
Yeah. Thank you for the super chat, Paul. A Roman agent opinions. This is in your.
Yes, it is because I think it's true. Technically,
by being an agent,
he's a I would call it a Herodian Roman agent, and I think he was originally trying to persuade Jews that follow Jesus that Jesus isn't quite what they imagined him to be. And this would only work after Jesus' death, so Jesus can't call Paul a liar and say, "You're lying about what I'm saying." Now, even canonical Paul was being called a liar. That's why I said, I'm not a liar, I'm not a liar, I'm not a liar. And you see more advanced arguments in Romans chapter 3 and all this other stuff, arguments I don't think the first Paul thought of. But the first Paul, he didn't really have much to say about trying to convince them. He tried. Based on what I see in First Clement, he didn't put in as much effort as canonical Paul does. I do not think canonical Paul was a Herodian, by the way, because he came from Giscala. He was a Jew born in Giscala. He's not related to the Herodians. That's why he makes this argument. Oh, I'm a Benjamite. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm a Pharisee. He's saying all these things that doesn't make sense of like what you see in Romans 16, 2 Corinthians 11. Those are bits that are reflecting a historical Paul from the 30s AD. That doesn't make any sense in the 90s. Paul fleeing from King Aretas as a full-grown adult in AD 37. Being a Herodian, Romans 16:11, that makes more sense of the earlier guy. And there is one more thing that we will need to pull up to finish that. But yeah, I think the other two are agents, but not quite in the same way. Canonical Paul is more like a propagandist, if anything. And then you get to the guy in the middle. Because I didn't talk about the guy in the middle too much. The one that acts as gearing the chronology around. Josephus mentions a guy called Saul, who also was a Herodian. Josephus says so, a kinsman to King Agrippa II. And so what happened here is that this Saul was the brother of Costobaros. They were sent to appear before Emperor Nero in 66 AD, as Josephus tells us in the Jewish words. After that, he never talks about them again. I suspect that's where the martyrdom of Paul from Nero's time came from. The Acts of Paul was reading Josephus. The author of Acts read Josephus and was gearing the chronology around that man that Josephus was talking about.
The Paulus guy.
That's Saulus in Josephus. Yeah, the other Saul. So Saulus, here, it'll be easier if I can show the slide.
Sure.
I pulled it up in case we brought it up at some point, and we are there. So he tells us here that Saul, I'll just read it. After this calamity had befallen Cestius, many of the most eminent of the Jews swam away from the city as from a ship when it was going to sink. Interesting metaphor Josephus uses there. Costobaros, therefore, and Saul, who were brethren together with Philip, the son of Jasimus, who was the commander of King Agrippa's forces, ran away from the city and went to Cestius. But then, how Antipas, who had been besieged with them in the king's palace, but would not fly away with them, was afterwards slain by the seditious, we shall relate hereafter. However, Cestius sent Saul and his friends, at their own desire, to Achaia to Nero, to inform him of the great distress they were in, and to lay the blame, notice here, to lay the blame under kindling of the war upon Florus, hoping to alleviate his own danger by provoking his indignation against Florus. In the meantime, the people of Damascus, when they were informed of the destruction of the Romans, set about the slaughter of those Jews that were among them. And as they had them already coped up together in the place of public exercises, which they had done out of the suspicion they had of them,
They thought they should meet with no difficulty in the attempt, yet did they distrust their own wives, which were almost all of them addicted to the Jewish religion. On which account it was that their greatest concern was how they might conceal these things from them. So they came upon the Jews and cut their throats as being in a narrow place, in number 10,000, and all of them unarmed. And this in 1 hour's time, without anybody to disturb them. So notice that this is an attempt to alleviate blame of causing the war. So this is a serious accusation they're laying against Florus there. Something I could easily see Emperor Nero getting pissed off at and saying, "Now don't shift blame. That's not Florus's fault. That's y'all's fault. That's y'all's fault. Excuse me. Y'all are at fault here, not Florus." And I could easily see Saul and Kosabaris getting whacked when that argument went poorly, as I think is likely the case. And notice here that what's Saul doing, Derek? Fleeing from Jews and Damascus is mentioned in this context. Just like the Saul in Acts, by the way. That's why in Acts it contradicts 2 Corinthians, and Paul is fleeing from people, from Jews 30 years later than the Paul did in 2 Corinthians. You see my point? The chronology is a mess. And Acts is clearly building a chronology off of the Saul mentioned here in Josephus.
So you're just taking it a step further from Steve Mason and saying, hey, we get it. It's building its chronology, but it's also character building based on also Josephus. And that's what you're kind of hinting at with this passage.
Oh, yeah. 100%.
Awesome. Wow. Okay. There's a lot here. I think we got one more here. Thank you, S. Mill, for the super chat and being a member. So you believe in Roman provenance for Paul now? Just curious.
I'm not using the term Roman provenance because, okay, so there's a complication here. What do we mean by Roman provenance? Often people imagine it means the Roman government engineered Jesus and Paul, which means neither of them ever existed. If that's what you mean by Roman provenance, I reject that completely as ridiculous. What Roman provenance for Paul, what do you mean by that? Because Paul being an agent does not mean Roman provenance for Paul, because he wasn't manufactured by the Romans. Now, on the other hand, there are some that can say, well, the Romans recreated Christianity, turned Jesus into a pro-Roman dude, but there was still a Jesus. But then I personally see a complication with using the term Roman provenance if you try to retain a belief in the historical Jesus while using that terminology. I'm open to having discussions with people that try to make that work. I'm having a hard time seeing how that makes sense, honestly. I would avoid using that term personally. I'm not a believer in Roman provenance.
Got it. Okay, we have caught up. I want to go ahead and plug you shamelessly here and hope that everybody who watches MythVision will go and subscribe to my boy Jacob Berman. The link is in the chat right now. I want to wrap things up here because I got to get some food in me, Jacob, and I haven't eaten since early this morning. And also, I've got to finish a script that I'm working on that I think is going to take off and do really, really well. I think a lot of people are going to enjoy this. This is a different kind of a script. So shameless plug for you. Do us a favor. Final words from you wrapping up our discussion today. Why scholars never agree about the Bible, what you need to know. Jacob, from you, man, take us into this.
Well, like I was saying earlier, it's when they put out a book, they're not likely going to change their mind. I'm not saying they won't change their mind, but it is likely that they won't. And they have a position to defend. They're trying to defend. Sometimes it can be the case where they're trying to defend their predecessors. And I get it. It sucks being wrong. I've changed my mind before. Likely will again. So it's okay to change minds. And I think a lot of people forgot what that means these days. And one more thing I will say is,
So, by the way, that Saul guy died in AD 66. Like I said, started the Jewish Wars, just to finish that part. So, first Paul died in 39. Second one died in 66 AD. The third one, I said 97 AD recently. It might be more like, no, yeah, 97 AD. Yeah, that's probably right. But anyway, what I'm going to say is Paul was heavily mythologized. He was heavily mythologized, just like Jesus. They're both historical. They both existed. But the mythologization wasn't just limited to Jesus. It also happened to Paul. And I'm not just talking about Acts. It's the letters too. And I think it's high time, that we start examining that.
Well, we're going to kick Paul's ass in the next episode and deep dive into that, because I think you're onto something with that as well. I hope people will subscribe to you. Please go check out Jacob. Jacob's doing all sorts of interviews. He has interviewed, again, as I said at the beginning, more academics than MythVision has. We've just had repeat guests. We've been doing it for years. But he's gone out and explored a lot of stuff that I haven't, talked to a lot of people that I haven't, and I hope to discuss with in the future some of these academics that you've talked to as well, Jacob. I really appreciate your time, man. Any final last words? We got some subscribers here. Thank you.
I have no further last words. I said my piece.
So help you God. Are you sure? No, seriously, man. Thank you so much for letting me hang out with you today. Listen to these different things, and it sounds like Paul's in trouble in the next episode, huh?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me on, Derek.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are MythVision. Have a nice day.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.